The point is, we are in a mind war, and we will lose every battle we don't know is even being fought. If we don't realize that we are in a mind war, we've already become a casualty. You have to have defenses. You have to have weaponry. You have to have knowledge of the enemy if you're going to win in the mind war. The people who were most controlled by the Matrix were the people who didn't know it even existed, which was almost everybody. So the point is, we have to red pill ourselves.
Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer. It is my pleasure to have Connor Boyack with us. Connor is president of Libertas Institute, a free market think tank in Utah. In that capacity, he has spearheaded a number of successful policy reforms in areas such as education reform, civil liberties, government transparency, business deregulation, personal freedom, and more. Public speaker and author of over 40 books, Connor is best known for the Tuttle Twins books, a children's series introducing young readers to economics, political, and civic principles. Connor is addicted to changing the world for the better, one life at a time. He primarily does this through the nonprofit he founded, Libertas Institute, one of the country's most impactful think tanks that helps reform policies in his home state and across the nation. Connor, it's so great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm a big fan of the Tuttle Twins. In fact, I have a handful of your books right here in my hand. For whoever's listening, I'm holding some books up, including The Law, the Tuttle Twins Learn About the Law, the Tuttle Twins and the Search for Atlas, the Tuttle Twins and the Education Vacation, and Tuttle Twins and the Leviathan Crisis. And these are not just for kids. I think adults learn amazing principles from them too, because I personally benefit from reading them to my 4-year-old. It just is a good reminder that, for example, a law is only legal. It doesn't mean it's just. It doesn't mean that it's fair or that it's appropriate. It just means that it's legal. So I'd love to hear your origin story of how you got down this track, how you ended up creating not just these books, but a whole foundation or institute to help change government.
Well, it started first with the Institute. This was in 2011. I found myself volunteering with different organizations. I was helping different people get elected. I just found that I had a certain skill set and passion for trying to engage civically like that. But I couldn't really find a home for myself. I didn't find any other organization that really suited me or that I thought was effective. And so I decided through a random turn of events to start my own. I had no clue what to do. I was a web developer. That's my background, is in online marketing and web development. And I had no clue what I was doing. So the early days were quite adventurous in trying to figure that out. And a few years into doing it, here I am working with elected officials, and I'm changing laws, and I'm having this influence. My children, a few years into it, were 5 and 3. So I had a 5-year-old boy. He was almost 6. And like any dad, I would, come home at the end of the day, tell me how your day was. What did you do today? They would tell me what toys they played with or what friends they played with. But when my boy was almost 6, he started to reciprocate the question to me. Dad, what did you do today? Where were you? And I found myself wanting to reply to him in a substantive way, not a superficial way. I didn't want to say, I made phone calls today, or I had meetings. Or, I wanted to help him understand Dad was fighting eminent domain at the local city hall today because they're trying to do this stupid project and steal these people's property. And so like any dad in my shoes, I turned to Amazon. This was in 2013. And I went searching for children's books that would teach concepts like property rights or free markets or even personal development and mindset and, responsibility and things. Came up short. There was like nothing. There was a little bit of stuff about like the Constitution for kids, or certainly there was religious stuff for kids. But for these kind of economic, civic, historical principles, there was nothing. So I was talking with a buddy of mine who's a dad as well, very like-minded, and we were kicking around different ideas, and we're like, let's do a kids book together. There was no vision for what it would become. There was no master plan. It was just a fun little side project, but enough people bought the book and really liked the first one, the law one that you pointed out, that was motivation for us to continue. And so we just continued on for a little while until that snowball going down the hill just got much bigger, much faster. Now we sold over 5 million copies. We got a cartoon, we got curriculum, we got all kinds of stuff. But it all just started with a dad who saw a need, who had a desire to help his own kids, and it all grew from there.
Amazing. And so do you homeschool your kids?
We do. Yep.
And why do you do that? What's the benefit, and what are the drawbacks?
So I am a product of what I like to call the public fool system. There was a...
I haven't heard of that before, but that's fun.
Growing up in Southern California, no less, in the 80s and 90s, and back in the days when homeschooling was perceived as, it was the weirdos that were, isolated from society, and that stigma or perception was there. I hated school. I did not enjoy it. I don't feel like I learned very much. I learned way more on my own, just reading and pursuing personal passion projects. I did not enjoy school. And I read a book when I was in college, because I went to college because that's just what you do. I was just on the conveyor belt of life that you're told, to get a job, you need a college degree. And so I was at college, and I came across a book from a former government school teacher named John Taylor Gatto. Gatto. He was a 30-year teacher in New York City, and he was winning all these awards. And he was at the peak of his career, and then he quit. He wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal titled "I Quit, I Think," in which he goes on to say that he was going to embark in a search for a profession where he could help kids without also hurting them. And his point was that try as he might within the system to inspire kids, to allow them to pursue their individual interests, to foster their curiosity, that they were being forced to adapt to a one-size-fits-all monolithic system where every kid has to learn the same thing at the same age in the same way as everybody else. So he ended up writing some books, one of which was called Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Education. And so in college, I read that book and I was like, oh my gosh, this is listing everything all the reasons why I hated school. And I was engaged at the time. I gave it to my fiance and I said, we ought to homeschool. We ought to, not do this with our kids. She went to public school as well. And so for me, it was a recognition of, I want the best for my child. And the government schools, as important as they are, perhaps as a social safety net for some kids who just need them because there's nothing better. It's like with college. Not every kid should go to college. Some should. And if they want to, great. But this expectation that everybody ought to go and everyone needs a college degree is ridiculous. I think it's the same with going to public schools. They can fill a need. The government can be there as a backstop. But I think what we really need in education is a competitive landscape of entrepreneurial endeavors that have totally different micro schools and private schools and home schools and this kind of amazing landscape of choice and abundance rather than this monopolistic system that's literally stuck in from a century ago that we're educating kids the same way. Think about AI. I mean, AI is, has the potential to totally disrupt education, and yet the teachers' unions are already fighting its use. They see it as a way to undermine what they've been doing for decades. So I just think there's a better way, and I want the best for my child, and I don't think the government schools are going to produce that. And so we made the choice to homeschool. You asked, I'll wrap up with this, Stephan. You asked, trade-offs. The positives are we can lean into my children's interests and passions and get them to love learning because they have the freedom and the flexibility to learn what they're curious about and explore life, which is what we all do. So why don't we afford that to our children? So there's huge positives in the flexibility and the customized curriculum that you can create. I would say traditionally the drawbacks were the social side where people, your kids aren't going to be socialized. Well, number one, when you look at the socialization that's happening in public schools, the bullying, the drugs, the vulgarity, the disrespect, that's not really the socialization I want for my kids. But number two, I think an innovation in the past decade in homeschooling is homeschool co-ops. Our kids for a decade have been in a homeschool co-op. So it's like 20, 30, 50 families all coming together to provide classes to one another's kids, to have social events, a moms group, so all the moms can have a support system. And so you get the benefits of a more like a mini school, if you will, but the benefits of homeschooling as well. And so I think that really cuts down the drawbacks that historically was associated with homeschooling.
Yeah. I have a whole episode with Mary Resenbeck where we go into the different kinds of curricula and options for homeschooling and the benefits and so forth. So if our listener is intrigued and want to learn more, then that episode, which we'll include in the show notes for this episode, will be available. Now, you mentioned the subtitle of one of John's books is The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling. What's the hidden curriculum in a nutshell?
Well, it's hiding in plain sight, and that is the absolute mediocrity that we've tolerated. And to illustrate this, I'll share a brief story. It was very recently that a group of education activists and stakeholders, they formed a group called forgetting their name off the top of my head. But they had this group, and they went around the country in America for about 18 months, holding a bunch of listening sessions with teachers and parents and students, and they reviewed curriculum and textbooks. They're trying to understand how are things going in America with education. At the conclusion of the 18-month survey, listening tour, they produced a report. They titled it A Nation at Risk. And in the report, they went on to warn that America's educational foundations are being undermined, and I'm quoting from the report, are being undermined by a rising tide of mediocrity. And that if a foreign government, they said, had attempted to impose upon America the very mediocre educational performance that now exists today, we might have viewed it as an act of war. As it stands, we've allowed it to happen to ourselves. Now, I told a little fib here. This report was not recent. This group did not recently meet and produce the report. That was over 40 years ago. It was during the Reagan administration, April 1983, when they put out this report. So when I tell this story to audiences, I typically will say at the end, raise your hands if you think education in America has substantially or measurably improved in the last 40 years. I've probably been in front of audiences that total about, 10,000 people plus that I've asked this question to. Literally not a single person, for obvious, selection bias. The audiences I'm speaking to already, understand the point here. But it's self-evident. Things have not gotten better. If anything, they've declined. Look at the National Association for Economic Performance, I think is their name. They do evaluations every year of public school kids, 8th graders, 12th graders, 4th graders. They produced something called the Nation's Report Card, where they use all these standardized assessments to try and assess how are things going. And about 3 or 4 months ago, they released an updated report on 8th graders, because they measure each grade in different years and so forth. 8th graders in America, only 13% of them, 13, not 30, 13% of them are proficient in American history. And so what happens to a society of mediocrity, of ignorance, of people who become voters and don't understand history, so they repeat it? People who can't even tell you anything about the Holocaust or World War II or, all kinds of atrocities the government has done because they're never taught. And so you asked the question, what was John writing about when he said the hidden curriculum of compulsory education? I think what's hidden is plain for all to see if you have eyes to see. If you're willing to really realize that things have been dumbed down to a level that you've developed a tolerance for, you think, oh, well, I went to public school and I turned out fine, so I'm going to send my kids, right? We've accepted this total mediocrity. When you go look, in fact, I wrote a book called, I don't know if I have it here, called Mediocrity, that just came out a few months ago, where we talk about this report I mentioned. And in that book, I share examples of 8th grade quizzes from over a century ago. You can find these on the internet. And most adults today would probably score like 15% on these 8th grade exams. The expectation that we used to have for our children, for our society, was so much higher. And so as someone who's trying to optimize myself, I often think through, what am I missing out on in life because so little was expected of me when I was growing up? And if I want my children to optimize their own lives, how can I help challenge them and give them an education that's actually going to hold them to a high standard and excite them and help them excel? And that's a question that I think too few parents ask, because it can lead to some uncomfortable answers. Oh, I got to sacrifice here. I gotta, be a part-time whatever so I can help my kids homeschool or send them to this micro school or whatever. But I think it's worth it. I think that sacrifice where it's necessary is worth it. Because I regret going to public school. I often reflect and wonder on how much further ahead I could be with my mission had I had that boost in the early years and not had to wait until after college to find that path. And so it's not hidden. It's available for all to see. We just have to pay attention to it, not have the blinders on.
Yeah. Well, what I get about, you mentioned how much farther you could be if you had gone to a better set of schools. I think it was essential to your mission that you went to those crappy schools. It
perhaps so. It does give me a story to share, right?
it gave you that life experience that you then had the motivation to turn things around for others so that they didn't have that mediocrity in their education when they grew up.
It's a great point. I appreciate that.
Yeah, there's a great Wayne Gretzky quote. Skate to where the puck is going to be. This occurs to me that where we're at with public education now is skating to where the puck was 100 years ago.
I agree with you. I often say that we're preparing our children, we're training them for an economy that no longer exists. Mm-hmm. Like the jobs, there's some data point about this. It's like 2/3 of the jobs that today's K through 12 students will have in the future do not currently exist.
Right.
And so how are we preparing our kids for that? What emotional resilience, what technological competence, what critical thinking and adaptive and flexibility skills we're giving them? And the current system that I don't know, what's the latest? I think it's like 90% of kids. Homeschooling has had this massive surge in the past couple of years. And so I think 90% of America's youth go to the public schools. I think the number of homeschoolers is just going to keep going up because the word has gotten out. You're no longer weird. If anything, it's the homeschool kids that can look an adult in the eyes and carry on a decent conversation. Things have totally flipped. And I think the toothpaste is out of the tube and it's just going to keep growing.
Yeah. Well, for sure, if you're going to skate to where the puck is going to be, you need to do something different. As a parent of a young child, I don't want him to learn just the rote sort of 1950s type curriculum. It just doesn't arm him with the skills he's going to need for a world with AI and so much advancement that it boggles the mind. Yeah. We need to teach our kids how to be anti-fragile, not just resilient. And that's not going to happen in the public school system.
Well, and Stephan, one of the big challenges that I come across relating to what you just said, you're a parent here that has the awareness sufficient to make those choices on behalf of your child, put him on a good path, prepare for their future. Most parents, in my experience, feel extremely inadequate in their own understanding of current events, world trends, technological progress, future developments on the horizon. Even like with our Tuttle Twins books, the core problem that they solve is that many of the parents who buy our books believe these concepts already. They believe in the ideas of human flourishing, about what a prosperous society looks like, that you need a strong currency that can't be debased by the corrupt politicians, that you need a system of private property to incentivize people to apply themselves, that you need a society of people who are personally responsible and not, living at the largesse of the government, and so on and so on. Many of these parents who get our books believe in these concepts, but they feel completely inadequate in articulating them to anyone else, let alone, or I should say, especially their children, because they can't engage in a Facebook comment with another adult about these ideas, let alone figure out how to simplify them and make them interesting to a 6-year-old. And so they don't. And they get shocked 15 years later when their kid is now an adult and they turn into someone who has radically different political views than they do, or believe in, harmful ideas that are detrimental to society. And the parents often throw their hands up. What happened? Where did my child go astray? And then I'll ask, well, tell me what your dinner table conversations were like. Help me understand how you talked to your kids about these types of ideas. Oh, well, I figured when they were a voter, when they were an adult, I talked. No, by then it's too late. They've been exposed to TikTok and YouTube and textbooks and peers and everything else. So it's the intentionality like you have with your child that I think all of us as parents need to say, despite my inadequacies and insecurities about my own knowledge and understanding, I need to red pill myself and pay attention to what's going on, if for nothing else than to give my children the best future possible. I owe it to them to be awake and alert to what's going on. And that's, again, uncomfortable for a lot of parents, but that's my call to action, is you really do need to wake up and realize what the stakes are.
Yeah. That's funny you use a red pill analogy. So you're a fan of The Matrix, I guess.
Second to scripture, I would say that Matrix is the best story that describes our human society. I should say the original, not any of the sequels, of course, but I think there's powerful metaphors in there that we can draw from for sure.
Yeah. Do you know that apparently, and I believe this to be true, The Matrix was a channeled work, and not from the Wachowski brothers, but from Sophia Stewart. Did you hear about this?
No.
Yeah. So I heard about it from a Metal Saturday. So Metal is a mastermind I'm in, run by Ken Rutkowski. And Sophia was one of the speakers one time. And that's where I heard about the whole story. She submitted the movie script as an entry in a science fiction writing contest back in, I think, the 80s. Didn't hear anything. And a decade and plus years later, she goes to the movie and then recognizes, wait a minute, that's my script.
Wow.
Yeah. And so she waged a legal battle. And of course, the powers that be are way too powerful. So she was not able to get a fair shake. But she wrote the first one. And you can tell the difference between the first one and all the sequels. They just don't hold a candle to the first one.
I'll tell you, Stephan, one of my favorite scenes in the first one that I think has a lot of relevance to our society is, I would say spoiler alert, but it's been like, 2.5
If you haven't
decades,
seen it by now.
At this point, you can't blame anybody else. It's the scene with the woman in the red dress. This is before Morpheus takes Neo into the actual Matrix once he's been liberated from it. They're in this simulated environment so he can explain what the Matrix is. Neo is walking down the street. He's bumping into all these people. And Morpheus says, look at these people, Neo. These people represent the minds of the very people that you're trying to liberate, that we're trying to liberate from the Matrix. But they are so hopelessly dependent, so inured. That was a new word for me. I had to go look that up after I watched The Matrix. It just means like a leech, like you're dependent upon this thing that you're attached to. They're so hopelessly inured to the system that they will fight you as you try to liberate them from it. And I remember, I saw that as a 16-year-old kid or something when I was young, or 18-year-old. So it didn't stick with me at the time. But ever since, I've thought about that quote over and over again, because in my line of work, I often find, like, here I am promoting these ideas that I believe in, free markets and personal responsibility and so forth. And there are people who don't agree with those things, who want entitlement, who want redistribution of wealth, who want guaranteed, rights of, housing and healthcare and everything else. And I know that my ideas will lead to the best human flourishing, the best self-confidence, the best prosperity. But the very people who these ideas would benefit often are the ones who are fighting you against it. And so it's just a fascinating trend to see as you try and liberate people from ignorance. It's like, how dare you tell me that I'm not as smart as you? Don't tell me to read that book. Just again and again, you encounter people who throw up those barriers and attack you, even though what you're offering to them can be very empowering to them. But there's a high level of resistance. And so I reflect on that quote often, because in my line of work, I just see it over and over again.
But you also have this situation where they're being manipulated by mainstream media, being told what to think. And so the powers that be decide to target you, unfortunately. Like, I know there was a whole thing with CNN making you look like a bad guy. And people aren't thinking for themselves. They're just taking what is told to them, programmed into them by Crisis News Network and wherever else, and then they're on the warpath and think that you are doing damage to society when they have never even picked up any of your books. I find it shocking. I have staff, or have had staff, who thought poorly of you and your principles without ever having read any of your children's books. And that just blew my mind.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we are prone to judgment as a people. We do judge books by the cover. I think it's part of how the human brain works, trying to conserve energy. It's always looking for social cues from others about, conclusions to make without having to expend the energy necessary to do that on your own, which is why I find the work of Edward Bernays so fascinating. I encourage everybody, all your listeners, to go to Amazon and buy his book, Propaganda. Maybe you can link it in the show notes. Yep. It was written over a century ago. Edward Bernays is a short book, but a very eye-opening book. I'll share a quote here in just a second. Edward Bernays was the double nephew of Sigmund Freud by birth and by marriage. He was his nephew. So he's learning from Uncle Freud how the mind works, how people think, how the brain, operates. But he was also working for Woodrow Wilson in the Committee for Public Information, which was the propaganda arm of the federal government designed to induce Americans to support World War I. And his job literally was to find ways to manipulate people, to encourage them to buy war bonds or support the war and so forth. Bernays is called the father of public opinion, and also the father of propaganda, because the two terms are basically the same. He's most known in the corporate world for example, in the 1910s, I think, cigarette smoking was not fashionable for women, and the cigarette companies wanted to double their total addressable market to add women in addition to men. They hire Bernays. Bernays says, here's what we're going to do at the big Macy's parade or whatever in New York, some massive parade. He hires these models to dress up as the Statue of Liberty, and they held cigarettes in the air as they walked down the city, and they called them torches of freedom. And it was right as you have this whole women's liberation movement. So it aligned, the perception of women smoking as this sign of liberation, which many women were really into at the time. So anyways, that's Bernays. Here's this quote from the book. And this gets to you talking about your staff making judgments about my work without reading it, or just how we all, our ideas, our opinions are so easily affected by these influences from others. He says that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they're to live together as a smoothly functioning society. In almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking, we are dominated by the relatively small number of persons who understand the mental processes and social patterns of the masses. It is they who pull the wires which control the public mind. So that was written over a century ago, before we had these little propaganda surveillance devices in all of our pockets that are just, with social media and everything, conditioning people to think a certain way. If that was true back then of those in power, that they could manipulate the habits and the opinions and the actions of people, what does it look like today? What will it look like with AI and deepfakes and everything else in the future? And if we want to understand truth, if we want to understand things as they really are, not as they are claimed to be, I think we have some serious introspection to do about our gullibility, the impressionability of your staff to make conclusions that I think are false about our work because they didn't know. The judgments that I make about what's happening to Israel and Hamas because I'm operating off of headlines that are heavily influenced by people who have a desire to shape the narrative of this conflict. How do we know what is true? How do we win in a mind war where everywhere around us the truth is under siege? That is a big question that I think we don't really confront as much as we should. We just kind of go along with our daily whatever, perhaps not realizing, as Bernays said, how controlled we actually are.
Yeah. That reminds me of a quote from Neville Goddard. And I just love this quote. It's so powerful. The thing, okay, there it is. There is a great difference between resisting evil and renouncing it. When you resist evil, you give it your attention. You continue to make it real. When you renounce evil, you take your attention away from it and give your attention to what you want. Now is the time to control your imagination and give your energy to what you want. And I think this relates to what we're talking about, because if you see a war for our attention, a war for us to feed them, whoever the them is, fear, then we perpetuate it. But if we see that every act, every word uttered or headline that we read, the hand of God is behind it, ultimately, because we all work for God. Even the dark side works for God, even if they, don't admit it. Then you just relax and trust that everything is divinely guided and orchestrated, and things are happening for our highest and best good, ultimately, even if it's just for our spiritual refinement, even though we have to go through what seems like hell in order to get there. What are your thoughts?
I love that. It reminded me of a quote I was just pulling up from Thomas. I think this is apocryphal. I'm told Jefferson didn't actually say this, but it's a famous quote. In matters of style, swim with the current. In matters of principle, stand like a rock. And just to your point about just going with flow, not resisting it, letting these things kind of happen and move through you. And it's just kind of interesting to me to I'll give you this example, because sometimes I think we do need to stand up in a sit down world where oftentimes people are passive. You've seen perhaps that photo of a bunch of Nazi or Germans doing the Nazi salute. And there's this one guy, standing there with his arms folded and not doing it. And that circulates the internet. It's actually a fascinating story who that guy is. He was married to a Jewish woman who was being persecuted, and he was feeling very disgruntled about that fact. And so it was kind of a matter of, and his wife was sent off to a camp, and he was sent off to a camp. And it's as with many of those circumstances, a fascinating story. But I think we all imagine that we would be like that guy. Oh, if I were in those circumstances, I would resist. When human history tells otherwise. You look at the Stanley Milgram experiment, the famous psychological experiment showing that over 2/3 of people will potentially kill somebody else simply because they are instructed to do so by a person of authority. Stanley Milgram, of course, created this experiment after he watched the Nazis on trial at Nuremberg, and afterwards citing as their defense, I was just following orders. I was just doing what somebody else told me to. And so he was at either Yale or Harvard, and he's like, this is curious. To what degree are people willing to go to commit atrocities simply because they were given orders to do so? So we created this experiment. It was this whole electroshock experiment where the electricity would progressively get harder, and individuals were instructed by someone in a lab coat. That was their authority figure, just a guy in a lab coat with a clipboard. And they were told to progressively administer more shocks. The person in the other room is screaming bloody murder by the end. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. And the guy in the lab coat, no, please continue. It's very important that we continue this experiment. 2/3 of people went all the way to the end and administered the potentially fatal dose. And so I don't think most of us would be like the guy folding our arms. I think most of us are the people who go along with what everybody else is doing, and under a combined set of pressures, political pressures, economic pressures, social pressures, most of us will do what we're told and go along with things. And so for me, it's a question of what can I do now to stand up when the time is right? We had an event happen just a few months ago with this 12-year-old boy, Jaden, in Colorado. His story went mega viral. I think it's got like 50 million views across social media now. He was kicked out of school for having a Gadsden flag patch on his backpack in a Colorado Springs Colorado school. For those who don't know, the Gadsden flag, it's that yellow "Don't Tread on Me." It was kind of an anti-British flag. The rattlesnake symbolized the 13 colonies joining together. And so Jaden, this kid, very patriotic kid, and he had this patch on his backpack. The teacher claimed that flag has origins in slavery and was therefore a disruption to the classroom environment. Kicked Jaden out, said you can't come back till you get rid of it. Jaden decided to stand up for himself. He said, nope, that's nonsense. I know my history. That's not true at all. It has no origins in slavery, had nothing to do with slavery. It was just a revolutionary era anti-British flag. He got mom involved. Mom, to her credit, secretly recorded the conversation with the vice principal as she's saying all this ridiculous stuff. Shared that video with me. I posted it on Twitter. It went crazy viral. Libs of TikTok, and everybody starts sharing it around of like, look at this thing. But the point that I bring this up for is that here's this 12-year-old kid who stood up. He had actually been reading the Tuttle Twins for about 3 or 4 years, so he knew American history. He knew about free speech. And what would the world look like with a million more Jadens, with kids who are informed about who they are, how the world works, what their rights are, what the dangers to those rights are? What would the world look like if we invested like this as parents, as teachers, in our young people? I think we would find far more people who are prepared to stand up when the time is right, when circumstances present an opportunity to like Jefferson said, to stand like a rock in matters of principle. I fear for I'm more of an optimist. I think through innovation and all kinds of things, there's actually like a lot of upside for the future. But there is a large part of me that has a lot of fear for the future. If 13% of 8th graders are proficient in American history, if we continue to produce this mediocrity, I worry about the aggregate impact of a distracted citizenry that is apathetic civically, that doesn't care about holding people accountable. Look right now at our political institutions. Everyone's getting away with literal murder and pedophilia and Epstein's client list and everything else. Our system, our institutions have degraded, and I think it's a byproduct of our societal breakdown and people's apathy. And so I guess to wrap this rambling up, my point is I think we need to be far more intentional in investing in the rising generation, in making a million more Jadens, in instilling them with this knowledge so that when the timing is right for them, they can stand up and they can be an influence for good to many other people.
Yeah, that makes sense. You mentioned you have a lot of fear for the future too, but also optimism. It reminds me of a quote that I read in one of Florence Scovel Shinn's books. It's called The Game of Life and How to Play It. It's from 100 years ago. Great book. And she says, fear is inverse faith. And I just think it's really important that we work hard to eliminate our fear, because it is inverse faith. It's the opposite of faith, that everything is in our highest good and that we are being guided and supported and loved from above by the Creator, and that this is all, for our spiritual refinement.
I think, Stephan, one of the better ways that I found to do that, I'll use language from our friends Dan Sullivan and Ben Hardy, is kind of the gap and the gain. The gap being this fear-based, what am I good enough? Am I doing enough? Am I far enough, further enough? The gain, by contrast, being looking backwards at yourself. I only recently have really been going deep into this concept of the gap and the gain. And to bolster your point about having that reliance upon our Creator and having that faith, I have seen for myself a huge boost in my own confidence and my own faith by looking backwards and seeing my progress, and seeing it's that whole corny poem about the footsteps in the sand, or what, like, I don't even remember how it goes. It's like, I looked back and there was only one set of footprints. And then, Christ is like, well, it's then that I carried you. Whereas the guy thought that he had been abandoned, and that's why, the second set of footsteps weren't near him. But the point being that when you look backwards, I think that I can see the hand of God in my life. It's harder for me to see it moving forward and in the present necessarily. But when I look backwards, I'm like, oh my gosh, all these things have worked out for my good. Even the challenges, even the trials, I'm being refined, as you said. I'm being shaped and molded into the instrument that God wants me to be. And so when I look backwards, then I start to be like, oh, it's happening, right? Like, yay. And that gives me more faith and confidence for moving forward.
Yeah. Do you get insight or I don't know, downloads, for lack of a better word, from above for any of your books?
My mom, I would say, is a conduit for revelation. She has a gift that I do not. She'll go on prayer walks and she'll come off of one of her walks and she's like, oh, here's the message for the day. I'm supposed to tell you this. Okay. And off I go. How it works for me, how it's worked in my life is that doors open, paths unfold before me. I have found in my life that certain people are in my life at the right time, or this opportunity arises that I never could have foreseen or concocted myself. And it becomes very clear to me, that's the path to go. Okay, here's who I need to work with. And that's how I kind of get my revelation, is through paths and people, rather than any direct messages for myself. But in answer to your question, it works that way with the books. Someone will suggest to me a resource, a book, a YouTube video, something that is precisely what I need to put into this story that I'm working on over here. And so I find that when I'm open to that guidance, those little situations kind of unfold and I start to recognize, oh, okay, this must be for me to use at this time in the story, or this is the message I need to write a book about right now, because this is what children need to be learning about, talking about. So I think it looks different for everyone. For me, it's more just being sensitive to those external, because I think in my estimation, it's very rare and seldom that God will directly, miraculously intervene in someone's life or through angelic intervention or what have you. I think more often we are instruments in God's hands for one another. And so the people in my life who can open those doors, or like, this is the ultimate who, not how, to use another Dan Sullivan term, the who's in my life that God can put in the path and say, Connor, if you try and think how you're going to do it, you're just going to kick against the pricks and go slow and not achieve what you need to be. Here's the who. Here's who you need to connect with, and I'm going to put them in your path, and then you're going to go 10x. So that's kind of how it tends to operate for me.
Amazing. Okay. So your latest book is on true conspiracies. How did that come about? Like, there must have been some sort of divine orchestration or some sort of synchronicities that helped bring that into fruition. So tell me a bit more about that and why that topic and not something else.
So my religious background, I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known as the Mormons, and some are familiar with the Book of Mormon because of the Broadway musical or whatever, but it's a book of scripture of Christ's visit to this continent. And in that book, there is a group of people called secret combinations. And they're basically a conspiratorial group of people who acquire political power through deceit. And then they use that power to oppress everyone else who disagrees with their agenda. And they murder and they commit whoredoms and all kinds of things and get away with it because their buddies are in positions of power. So this book, even though it's subtitled, The Book of Mormon, is another testament of Jesus Christ, and it's a message about Christ. It's also a warning manual about what these conspiratorial elements in society, these evil people, can do. And this society, they're called the Nephites in this book, completely implode because they're just infested with these secret combinations. So all growing up, I've read this book, and it's kind of this warning manual, I think, for our society today. And I try and extract from it kind of the lessons that I need to learn. And so when I look around our society and I see so much corruption and so much conspiracy, I worry that the same thing that book describes can play out in our day. And I don't want that to happen. I don't want our society to implode and deteriorate and just become corrupt to the core. So for years, I have followed kind of conspiracy, whatever, right? Theories, if you want to call them that. And I never really followed Alex Jones too much, but just kind of that world and the Bilderberg groups and the Trilateral Commission and, all these people. So I had kind of had my finger on that pulse for a while. And now here I am doing these Tuttle Twins books, and I'm thinking, I think realizing that there are evil people doing evil things is such a critical way to better understand truth, to realize that truth is under siege, that there are people actively trying to deceive you. Mm-hmm. What better way to teach our young people critical thinking than to give them not conspiracy theories about maybe or what if, but conspiracy facts. So our book, when I decided to write this, I said, I only want to include conspiracies that are fully documented. For example, I think JFK was assassinated by the intelligence community. I think the evidence for that is very strong. Is there a document that I can point to, something that is conclusively demonstrated that? No. So I didn't include that in the book, even though I have my strong assumptions. Hmm. The book, the filter is actual conspiracies for which there is unquestionable documentation. I'll share a very brief one of the ones I like to share. This is during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the commies are in Cuba setting up shop, missiles and soldiers and everything. And there was this fringe group of activists in America that thought we should go to war. We should initiate military conflict in Cuba to stop the communists. Why do I say that they were this fringe radical group? At the time, polling very clearly showed that Americans did not want to go to war in Cuba. They didn't want to trigger World War III. But this group did. So this group came up with a plan. They said, what if we shot a bunch of people in like Miami and we shot down a plane or they bombed people in Miami. That's what it was. It was a bomb. They shoot down a plane and they shoot a bunch of people on rafts fleeing Cuba in the search for freedom here in America. We'll kill all these people, but we'll make it look like the Cubans did it. This is what's called a false flag event, of course, stemming from the days of piracy when the pirates would put up a false flag to make you think, oh, it's another American ship, and you get close and they attack you and board you. Mm-hmm. So it's this act of deception designed to manipulate how people think and act. This fringe group of radical activists created this plan, and they somehow got an audience with the President of the United States, who at the time was JFK. JFK reviewed this plan. He's like, no, we're not doing that. He rejected the plan outright. Now, the reveal here is that this fringe group of radical activists that I'm referring to was actually the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States military, the top brass of the Department of Defense, who, mind you, have sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution and protect American lives, literally proposed in a formal document that's been declassified. You can read it yourself. It's called Operation Northwoods. One word, Northwoods. They proposed killing a bunch of Americans, making it look like Cubans did it, so that Americans would get angry and demand we go to war and send more Americans to die in this war against Cuba. And so as I share that one of 20 examples in the book, the point is not to just point fingers or say evil or whatever. It's to say, let's be on guard for what's happening today. Yeah. It could be with the deal in Ukraine. It could be with Israel. It could be our economy. It could be manipulating jobs reports to try and make Bidenomics look good. Pick your issue. The point is, we are in a mind war, and we will lose every battle we don't know is even being fought. If we don't realize that we are in a mind war, we've already become a casualty. You have to have defenses. You have to have weaponry. You have to have knowledge of the enemy if you're going to win in the mind war. The people who were most controlled by the Matrix were the people who didn't know it even existed, which was almost everybody. So the point is, we have to red pill ourselves. We have to wear that psychological armor and have weapons and knowledge of the enemy if we're going to win. And so that's the point of this book with these 20 examples is look at all these past examples, but let them serve as evidence for you to realize that, oh my gosh, I need to be far more of a critical thinker and media skeptic today, assuming that we're just constantly being lied to by those who want to push an agenda.
My equivalent to that is like defensive driving on the freeway. If you,
how do you mean?
So I take a stance of defensive driving when I get in my car, because I'm not going to assume that everybody is completely sober and 100% responsible and paying attention. Like just the other day, I saw somebody swerving back and forth across lanes, and I pass him, and he's got his phone fully in front of his face. Like older guy who I guess needed to have it like right 2 feet ahead of him and straight in front of his face. It blew my mind. Like, whoa, that's crazy. So if you show up in a defensive stance to make sure that you're going to stay safe on the road, if you take that same sort of defensive stance when you consume media, or you participate in conversations with people who are just reciting stuff from the media without having fact-checked anything, or if you're being manipulated to vote in a particular way, whether it be through advertisements or what have you, you need to have that defensive stance. And that's what I take from what you were saying.
I think that's prudent, and because you're right, you never know the circumstances other people are in, their intoxication, their awareness. And I think the same is true of our society. And again, you go back to our earlier conversation about the public schools. Are those students being equipped with this type of knowledge, self-awareness, awareness of their external environment and the world around them? Or are they being put these like little woke goggles on, like this lens through which they look at everything in our society, and it's all kind of manipulated? I think, again, the answer is self-evident. So this all boils down to just me as a dad. I want what's best for my kids. I feel like I'm in a position where I can help serve other parents with resources to help them help their kids. And for me, Stephan, it all boils down to this. I don't think we're going to save our country at the Capitol. I don't think we're going to save our country in the courtroom, suing the government. I think if our country's to be saved, it's at the family dinner table.
Yeah.
It's having dinner table discussions about real world issues. It's fostering critical thinking in our kids. It's helping them understand our ideas. It's us learning about our beliefs.
Situational awareness.
Correct. Totally. And even if you just look at the number of families having dinner, it's just totally declined, let alone having meaningful dinner discussions or other discussions as a family. I think that's where we need to optimize for at a societal level, is at the family level, and empowering parents to take more initiative, whether they're going to homeschool or private school or even public school, but be more involved, be more aware of what your children are learning. Give them a counter agent. Half of the families who read Tuttle Twins, about 52%, send their kids to a school, and most of them are public school. But those parents realize that their kids not only are not learning these ideas in school, but they're often being taught quite opposite ideas. And so for them, the Tuttle Twins becomes kind of a counter agent in the home to say, all right, yeah, your head was filled with that kind of nonsense. Like, let's read this story together and talk about it while you're here with me.
It's like an antidote.
Whatever your situation, like an antidote, exactly. Yeah. Whatever your situation, my final call to action here, Stephan, my plea to your audience and to myself is just a higher level of intentionality. Be aware that we're in a mind war. Be aware that your children's minds are ground zero in the conflict. And just as you would never send your adult child off to some war in the Middle East without body armor and a weapon and rules of engagement and knowledge of the enemy, don't send your children out into the psychological battles of today without armor and weaponry and knowledge. Let's give them that at a minimum. It requires that we be awake, aware, engaged, but it's a cause that's worth it, and it's how we can restore the strength of our society.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Well, thank you for everything you do in the world for not just our children, but for all of us. And again, your website, the book series is the Tuttle Twins. Your website is TuttleTwins.com. And also your Libertas organization, the website for that is
Libertas.org.
Libertas.org. And if somebody wanted to follow you, listen, learn from you, where should they go? What's the best spot?
Twitter, or X, I guess we're supposed to call it now. I'm C Boyack there. That's where I spend most of my time. What would you call it? A platform that actually stands for free speech. So I'm investing more of my time and attention there. But I'm all over social media, very easy to find. Or my website is connorboyack.com, where you can learn more about me and my work.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Connor. And thank you, listener. Thank you for being open-minded to, changing the world and making a difference. We'll catch you on the next episode. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.